Hello and welcome to the show. Now, as Project Cars nears release, I've seen quite a few people trying to compare it to the likes of Forza 5 and Gran Turismo. I've even seen a few morons trying to compare it to Forza 6. Yes, let's compare it to a game where we know one car and we know what the cover picture is. Don't ask. I digress though. I've seen quite a few people comparing this to Forzas and Gran Turismos, and I don't really think that's very fair on either game, to be honest. Because the Forzas and Gran Turismos of this world are all about giving you a large number of cars, giving you a great variety of vehicles for you to drive around the track. You can go from a Volkswagen Beetle to a Mazda 787B. It's all about giving you lots of vehicles to play with. Whereas the likes of Project Cars, it's all about getting you to perfect a small number of cars. I mean, people complained about Forza 5's car list being tiny, and it was quite small compared to previous games, but it's far larger than that of Project Cars. But Project Cars is about perfecting a car and track combination, whether it be this Group 5 car at Snetterton, whether it be a Formula A at Catalunya, or whatever vehicles it is that you're interested in. It's about perfecting them. It's not about giving you all of the cars in the world for you to drive with. Yes, Forza does call itself a simulator. Yes, it's got decent physics engine, but it's never going to be as realistic as the likes of Project Cars, iRacing and so on, because it's trying to be more inviting, it's trying to be more open for all comers, whereas something like this is all about the realism. So perhaps a more fairer, a more interesting comparison would be Project Cars against iRacing. Now, iRacing, yes, is all about multiplayer competition, and I can't test the multiplayer competition in Project Cars really because it's not fully released yet. So I don't know what's going to happen when all the public get hold of it and there is no single player in iRacing. But what we can compare is the physics between the two games. So I set up a little test to start with. We've got the same car, this Mclaren GT3 vehicle, going to take the same tracks, same driver, and I'm using a Fanatec CSR wheel for all of this. The only slight variation that I'm not actually sure on is the setup on the cars. Both the cars will run with completely standard setups. I'm not sure if the standard setup between the two games is different or not. That's the only possible small variation. But yeah, I've tried to keep everything as fair as possible, keep everything all the same. Now for the first test, I was going to be doing just 5 laps on each circuit. I'd take 3 tracks, 5 laps on each game, and see how the lap times compared. Now I like doing these tests with just a small number of laps because it forces you to learn the track quickly. You've got to get as much out of the car, you've got to learn the track as quickly as possible because you've only got 5 laps to get a quick time out of the car. Which is, yeah, it's a good test to see sort of how difficult a game is to learn, if you like. I had no problems with the McLaren on Project Cars. I think I ran wide at turn 1 a couple of times, which is very easily done on this circuit. Aside from that, I had no real issues on Project Cars. We then come to iRacing. Now, I've played Project Cars long before I ever got iRacing, and as soon as I did get iRacing, the first car you start off with is a Mazda MX-5. There's no real equivalent to that on Project Cars. However, instantly the game felt familiar. Instantly the driving felt familiar between the two. So it wasn't sort of too daunting going into iRacing because it did feel quite similar to Project Cars. And when we go racing here, as you can see from the replay footage already, yes, everything does look very, very similar. And everything does drive very similar. Of all the tracks, Watkins Glen has perhaps got a couple of the bigger variations between the two games. The first big thing is the curbs. The curbs here are a lot more vicious. You cannot get away with running the curbs. On the very first lap I did, I clipped the curb and just spun the car around. I think it was coming up the fast chicaney bit. And you don't do that on Project Cars. If you run the curbs, you can get away with it, you're fine. And turn 1 as well, the inside curb. If you clip the inside curb, it'll cause problems for you on iRacing. Didn't have that on Project Cars. Also, the braking is slightly different. The braking into turn 1 is a little bit different. You can brake quite a bit later on iRacing than you can on Project Cars. Now, I'm not sure if the braking boards are in a slightly different place between the two games. I'm braking about the 200-meter board on iRacing, the 300-meter board on Project Cars. Everywhere else feels very similar. Braking points are about the same. But, yeah, turn 1 seemed a little bit different. I'm not sure on that. The other thing that I did find is I made a lot more mistakes on iRacing, as you're about to see coming into the fast chicane. I just locked the rear wheels up and yeah, that's the car gone. That was the final lap of my 5-lap run, ruined on that one. Yeah, mistakes were much easier to make on iRacing. Second track, we move on to the Zolder circuit. A fantastic track, I really do like driving here. It should be in more games. Hope to see it in Forza 6. It's a great track, lovely, lovely circuit. A good challenge for the cars as well. There's a mixture of fast corners and these slow chicanes. Now the first big difference that you will see, and probably the only really big difference on this track between the two games, this corner here, you get airtime. On Project Cars, it's not a lot. When you look at the replay, you don't really get that much airtime. It feels like you've got a huge amount of airtime when you're on board, but from the replay viewpoint, you don't actually get that much. But you do get the car in the air. I'm suspecting the suspension wouldn't really thank you very much for that one. This next chicane is always a little bit of a funny corner. It feels like you should be braking a lot earlier than you actually do. You can brake really quite late into it, but from like as you run up to it, it looks like it is really tight. But it looks like you can't get away with braking as late as you do. Turn 1 is also a little bit funny. It's kind of a big open corner that yeah, it's sort of a blind turn. Takes a little bit of getting used to. Where I had the most problem on Project Cars, turn 2 and 3, just trying to carry a little bit too much speed and running wide. A very common thing. I've driven Zolder with a variety of different vehicles, and that's always what I end up doing. It's turn 2 and 3. It's just trying to push it as much as you can, and you just run a little bit wide on the gravel. Yeah, I did that a couple of times, but yeah, again, I had no real problems with the McLaren learning this track. I had no issues. The curbs, yes, the curbs are quite vicious through the chicanes. They are quite big curbs, and they will chuck the car around. But yeah, aside from the couple of running wides, I didn't have any issues. So we come on to iRacing, and again, things felt very, very similar between the two games. I did the driving on Project Cars first and then went to iRacing, and especially at Zolder here, it was exactly as I remembered it from Project Cars. Braking points exactly the same on pretty much all of the corners. Yeah, it was incredible. If these two games looked identical, I probably couldn't have told you the difference between them for the most part. There was still a couple of small differences. The curbs were vicious here, but they were vicious on Project Cars. So yeah, I don't think they were any more vicious this time out on iRacing. The thing that I did struggle with slightly on this game is McLaren was a little bit more oversteery. Also, if you lock the brakes up, or I think it's easier to lock the brakes up on this game than it was on Project Cars. The jump doesn't exist on iRacing either. It's just a corner. There's no airtime. That's probably the biggest difference between the two tracks, is that you don't actually get airtime over there. The rest of it, it's remarkably similar. It feels very much as if it could be on the same game if they looked identical. This chicane is still the same. You think you should be braking earlier than you actually need to be. The curves on that chicane, I think, are a tad scarier, are a bit bumpier, but not by a huge amount. The one thing that I did find myself doing was, again, this just locking the rear wheels into the first corner this time, and then I tried to get on the power a little bit too soon out wide, and that didn't work, and I promptly bumped a wall. I did have a couple of times running wide through the second or third corner. But aside from that spin, yeah, things at Zolder were pretty similar, or they were very, very bloody similar. And we move on to our final track with I had just the mere 5 laps to practice. The Donington Park circuit, another place. I don't mind this track, not my favourite. A couple of corners are fantastic. Couple of corners that I struggle on, and yeah, I was beginning to there's just a tiny little difference in the physics. It's all to do with when you're trying to find the limit in where you can push the car. The thing is, on Project Cars, with this small number of laps, I could be a lot more confident with the vehicle. Now, what it is, I think at least, is Project Cars is a bit more forgiving. Basically, I ran wide at turn 1 there. I was across the grass. I ran wide another corner further back. And if you run wide here, you keep your foot down and you can probably get away with it. Occasionally, if you've got it really wrong, you may spin across the grass and have a big accident. But normally, if you run a little bit wide, you can get away with it. And generally, finding the limit of what you can do with the car is not too bad on here. Even with this small number of laps that I had, it wasn't too bad. I wasn't having many accidents. I wasn't having many offs. I don't think I had any offs aside from, I didn't have any spins or anything. I had a few running wide moments, but never had any really big accidents. Never clonked the wall at any point. Whereas when it comes to iRacing, it's quite a bit different. It's not that the cars feel as if they have different levels of grip. If you get a corner like perfect on both games, they feel identical. If the games looked the same, it would be very difficult to tell which one you were playing, aside from there's a couple of big giveaways. But yeah, if you've taken a corner perfectly on both games, they feel almost identical. The big giveaways are, well, first of all, the curbs. They're more aggressive on iRacing. They'll throw you around a lot more. The other thing is getting to the limit of grip. In iRacing, it's you get to the limit, and if you go a millimetre over it, you have a very big crash. Basically, whereas on Project Cars, it's a lot more forgiving. It's a lot more gradual incline up to the limit. On iRacing, you tend to be kind of slow around a lap, trying to get to the limit, and then the minute you step a fraction over it, you have a big crash. So actually finding that sweet spot is very difficult, and with this number of laps, it is very difficult to get to that limit, and that's probably the big difference. That is the big difference. The brakes were a tad... Now, I'm not sure if that's to do with brake pressure or the way my steering wheel is set up. That could be causing problems. It shouldn't be, but I don't know, because I was more likely to have a lock-up and lock the rear wheels on iRacing. That's kind of where I had a little bit of problem you saw with a couple of spins in the early ones. I didn't have any spins at Donington. As you saw, I did run wide through turn 1. That's another little bit of a giveaway which game you would be playing, is that if you go off on the grass in iRacing, you are far more likely to have a big accident. You're far more likely to have a big spin and have a big crash. You just can't get away with putting wheels on the grass in the same way that you can on Project Cars, so you've got to be a little bit careful on that. Just in general, the main difference between the two games that I had found from this first test is that Project Cars is just more forgiving. It's easier to get up to your talent barrier, if you like, if that makes sense. It's easier to get a quicker lap time out of Project Cars than it is to get it out of iRacing. If you can take that perfect line, then yes, they are remarkably similar, but it's a lot harder to get that perfect line, that perfect lap out of iRacing. So yeah, the curbs on that final corner, I don't think were as bad. I think they were quite bad. Well, they were bad for both. It was a horrible bloody curbs they've got at that chicane. It didn't feel that much worse on iRacing this time round, though. Small track differences, but again, there's nothing, there's nothing much. Our final track, we went to Brands Hatch. Now, this wasn't about 5 laps. I spent a lot longer with both games, and just seeing what happens if I keep driving and keep practicing, getting faster and faster lap times. See if the results would be any different. One big thing that I did notice between the two games, Brands Hatch feels a lot more bumpy in Project Cars. The other tracks all felt remarkably similar. Like, there wasn't... I think maybe Zolder was a tiny bit more bumpy in a couple of places on Project Cars, but Donington felt identical. Watkins Glen didn't feel different either. Brands Hatch was noticeably bumpier. I'm not entirely sure why that is, and I'm not sure which one is more accurate. Again, it could have been perhaps a little bit to do with the car as well. I mean, with this lap, I was constantly banging the splitter on the floor all the way around this bloody course. You could hear the splitter crunching against the ground with the Mclaren. But yeah, it was the only one that really felt massively sort of different in one aspect. I mean, the actual track itself was, again, remarkably similar. Braking points were very, very similar. I think the big difference that I had between the two games here is that I was a little bit more confident getting on the power in Project Cars. I was more confident in putting the power down so I could get a little bit more speed out of the corners. The early stage of this lap, things were very close between the two cars. We get to the later stages and things are a little bit different. The problem is that I'm just more confident on Project Cars. I spent a hell of a lot longer to get to this stage on iRacing than I did on Project Cars, and I still couldn't go quicker because I couldn't carry the speed. I still wasn't basically a good enough driver on iRacing to get the speed out of the car. Whereas on Project Cars, you could get up to the limit and you could carry the speed a lot easier. It was easier to get up to this level. As I said, I mean, this was, I don't know, I think it was probably 20 laps of practice. On Project Cars, it was a hell of a lot more on iRacing, and still, you can see now I'm a fair way back. But I don't think this was the very fastest lap, because I lost the replay of the very fastest lap I did on Project Cars. But you can still see it's just quicker, and it's the exit of the corners. I could get on the power a little bit better, and I was a little braver on the brakes. It wasn't by very much. As I said, if you get the perfect corner on iRacing and the perfect corner on Project Cars, they are bloody similar. They are really very, very similar. And this pretty much sums up my drivings. I've got it. I may about break myself. After my quick lap, I've ended up in the sand. Yeah, iRacing is a lot more difficult to get to that stage. When it comes to the lap times, well, of the 3 that were given just 5 laps, it kind of reflects what I expected almost. Project Cars is always quicker. Not by a huge amount. Certainly, Zolder, we're only talking about a second here. Donington Park is a couple of seconds. It's not by a huge amount, and that's all to do with it's easier to go faster in Project Cars, if that makes sense. I have no doubt a much better driver than I on iRacing could do those lap times. I've no doubt they could. With a lot more practice, I probably could. But it's just easier to go quicker on Project Cars. It's just that little bit more forgiving. It's still very, very similar. It's easier to get up to that very fast lap time on Project Cars. Watkins Glen, there we go, I hate saying that name, is a little bit of an odd one out. Not sure about that one. Not sure quite why there is such a big difference between the two. Slightly confuses me. Yes, the turn 1 did feel a little bit different between the 2 games, but that was the only place that ever felt massively different. I'm not sure why there's such a huge... Maybe the track is a little bit different between the games. I don't know. It was the first one I drove, so maybe my driving on iRacing was a little shonky as well. I'm not sure, but that does seem like a pretty big gap. And again, Brands Hatch, another couple of seconds lap difference, and that was mostly in the final sector of the lap. The first half was very similar. Even with the amount of practice I had, I just wasn't quite as quick. I wasn't quite as confident when it came to iRacing. But as far as comparing the physics between the 2 games, it is mighty close. As I said before in the video, if they looked the same and you were a good driver on iRacing, you wouldn't be able to really tell the difference. That's it's just how long it takes you to get to the speeds, if that makes sense. That's what's kind of the telltale between the 2. iRacing is just that tiny little bit harder or less forgiving for any mistakes. But yeah, that is certainly a compliment to Project Cars physics. It is mighty close between the 2 vehicles. And yeah, very good fun to find out this one. Anyway, that is it for this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, goodbye.